Hello, everyone, and welcome to Vegas Legal Magazine podcast. I'm Mark Fierro with Tyler Morgan, publisher of Vegas Legal Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's Wednesday, June 3rd. The Las Vegas community waits for word as 29-year-old Metro officer Shea Michelonis is in critical condition after being shot in the head while simply doing his job during the protests over the killing of George Floyd on the Las Vegas Strip. At a time when our community and the rest of the nation are going through tensions unlike anything we've felt in modern times. After the global lockdown due to COVID-19, we're now confronted with the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Today, we'll be talking with attorney Paola Armeni of Clark Hill. Armeni is known in legal circles as taking on some of the toughest cases against Metro police in police killings, shootings, beatings, and assaults. As someone who's closely watched the Metropolitan Police Department over the years, one thing should not be forgotten, and that is that it wasn't too long ago that Metro was dubbed one of the deadliest police forces in the United States. And now, the department can claim a dramatic change in the way they police and in their resulting numbers. Paola Armeni, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So give us the overview, give us some of the cases, a thumbnail of some of the cases that you've handled against Metro over the years.
I've had a couple. Most of my cases are all excessive force cases. 3 have gone to jury verdict with a jury successfully finding liability on the Metro officer's part. Probably the biggest case was one by the name of my client's name was Charles Bernard, where his neck was ultimately broken and the jury awarded over $2 million to Mr. Bernard.
Over the years, there's always been something of a tradition in Las Vegas, and that is that there's one attorney that stands out as being the one who will take on the toughest cases against Metro for decades. That was Cal Potter, tough as nails. And now, by default, it's you. Here you are. Have you seen a change in Metro over the last few years?
I mean, I think yes. I think you have to give credit where credit is due. They have definitely looked at some of their policies. They've really strived, I think, in the last couple of years to focus on de-escalation, which is huge. And then obviously with the enactment of the body cameras has been, I think, huge both ways. I think it has protected good cops that are just doing their job, and at the same time shown maybe when the police officer is not acting in accordance with how they should be acting or in complete contradiction to what their police report said.
That's interesting. You know, I've had long talks with police friends of mine, and for years, the idea that a police officer could ever be arrested was just, we obviously didn't know history, but now it's happening left and right. And I think in part because of the body cams, because now people say in the back of their minds, they always gave police the benefit of the doubt. And now they say, you know, I bet you I didn't see the only one that this happened to. What happens when you take these cases to jury now?
And I think that's the thing. I think most people, including myself, don't want to, let me back up. It's a very sad day in the community when a police officer is found liable for a civil rights violation, because we all want to feel protected. We all want to believe that all police officers are good. And it's like any other thing. There's good and there's bad everywhere. And we can't forget that. And I think one of the things when I'm talking to a jury is I recognize that. I recognize that the particular maybe officers that are before them are not representative of their entire community. And I think that's an important recognition to be made. You know, we all make mistakes, but we all need to be also held accountable. And that's where I think we're either through civil litigation and now more through the criminal justice system, we're starting to see the accountability. I will tell you, Mark, that I think there's still a lot to be done with the accountability in the criminal justice system, because they normally, at least in my experience of what we've seen in our community, is when something egregious has occurred with an officer and they are charged criminally, they're not charged to the same level that an average citizen would be if they had done the same conduct. So it seems to me that in the criminal justice system, they're still getting a little bit of the benefit of the doubt in how they are charged from the beginning, which, as we all know, you know, cases get resolved all the time. But when you start off, for instance, with a voluntary manslaughter instead of a first-degree murder, that voluntary manslaughter can much easily be negotiated to something less than a felony.
Do you think they're getting the same benefit of a doubt from a jury in some of these cases?
Do I think, sorry, who gets the benefit of the
Police
doubt?
officers, you know, they get sort of a little bit of a benefit of the doubt in the justice system. But what about facing a jury? Does a jury tend to lean harsher on police officers, or give them more of a benefit of the doubt, do you think?
You know, I think again, like what I was saying is I believe that people want to believe that police officers are good, right? Because we don't want to ever be in a position that we're doubting that whether police officers are good or not. I do think from talking to different jurors before we even select a jury panel, it's quite interesting to see how many people have had both negative experiences and then at the same time, you know, are so on the other side of it that they could never in a million years think that a police officer did anything wrong. So it's interesting when we're going through the voir dire process to hear people's stories and the two different dynamics. You just hope you get a mix on your jury that can talk it out and be open-minded.
Police always have something of a confrontational relationship with the media. When I was a reporter, I did, and I had the cop beat for years and years and years. But it's funny how what is painful at the time can come back to actually help a department like Metro. The five-part series that the RJ did years ago, and police hated the RJ as a result of it. And now, when you look back, it puts in perspective just how far they've moved the ball. There's an article, excellent follow-up article, Quartz, December 2015, Daniel Hernandez, how one of the deadliest police forces in America stopped shooting people. And so when you go back in time and you hear those names, Trayvon Cole, he was dealing marijuana, of all things, of the Gulf War veteran, you know, trapped in his car, surrounded by police, shot to death. We just don't see that now. We don't see that kind of super aggressive, heightened, and it's as if Metro has learned to dial back some of that need to control the situation, which was the mantra for years.
Right, and I think bringing that to their attention and making them understand that people are watching what they're doing and there needs to be change. So again, where credit is due, they have taken some of this under consideration and have tried to make some changes that are positive to our community. It's not perfect still, but there have been great strides that have been made. But albeit if the media didn't get involved and there wasn't a public outcry, you know, who knows if things would change. So that's why that part of it is very important.
You know, as a follow-up to that series that the Review Journal did, which really was an amazing piece of journalism, they looked back at 20 years of police shootings. And as a result, the Department of Justice investigated as a direct result of that piece of journalistic work. And the Department of Justice came with 75 recommendations on curbing the use of force. It was interesting to watch that deacceleration, how the first thing is, you know, time is on our side. We don't necessarily, unless it's a barricaded suspect, we don't necessarily have to, you know, try and go in and grab the situation in the first couple of seconds.
Right. I mean, I think, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm interested in your perspective, not just as an attorney, but as an attorney who follows the news on a day-to-day basis and watching the way these things have evolved over the years.
I mean, I think again, we all know, and officers have to make split-second decisions a lot of the times, and we all understand that. But sometimes they can slow down the process. They can make it so it's not moving so rapidly. They have the ability to do that. And I think learning some of these techniques, you know, we all have bad days and we make poor decisions in those bad days. And I think, you know, police officers have to be more patient. Them losing their patience with somebody can turn a situation that could have been completely de-escalated, turn around 360 and make it 100% worse. And, you know, we rely on our police officers to be patient with the community, because at the end of the day, they're community partners. You know, that's the relationship that should be happening, is they're part of our community, and there should be a mutual respect between the community and the police officer, and the police officer with the community. And once that relationship is built, I think you start to see a different dynamic of how everybody treats each other and the patience people have for each other.
One of the things that I was wondering, especially this week, given with the incident that happened in Minneapolis and the officer's history with the force, it sounded like he had, troubled history as a police officer. Do you think that some police officers are getting a little too much slack by the department and they're able to get away with too much, and therefore it kind of presses forward and they keep, pressing more and more?
So I think that's
maybe we need to be a
twofold,
little more
Tyler.
harsh?
Metro has an internal affairs bureau, and you can, if anything happens, you can post a complaint you can go online and you can make a complaint. And I encourage people to do that, because sometimes things happen and Metro is not even aware of it because people aren't speaking up. So that is a way that the community, if they feel like they've been wronged, can at least bring Metro's attention to it. So if this continues to happen with an officer periodically, then Metro's on notice at this point. I'm not so sure people are always doing that. So, I think the community needs to know if they feel like they've been wronged to whatever degree, that is a mechanism for them to speak up and let Metro know that they had this particular incident with an officer.
It just seems like sometimes you hear these stories and you just wonder, like, how is this guy still a police officer?
Well, and I think that's where we come back to the systematic accountability, right? I mean, we can talk about individual officers and their relevant conduct, but even with the civil rights litigation, they're very far removed, the individual officers. Even if a jury comes back and finds them liable in a civil setting, not a criminal setting, in a civil setting, I'm not sure much is done. I'm not sure if they're suspended or they lose their job, or, they're not really dragged into the process of the civil litigation. They're removed. So if there's a mediation, the individual officers aren't usually present. If there's trial, then usually they're there, but how often do trials really happen? So I feel like, although, yes, they're being sued, they don't feel what it's like to be sued like maybe you or I would, where we're in the thick of it. I mean, they're somewhat sheltered, and then it doesn't appear, I may be wrong, but it doesn't appear that there's always consequences even after a jury has spoken. So when you take those things into consideration, why would there be change? There's really no accountability.
There are conservative voices saying that part of this has to do with the police unions, and that is that a cop goes bad, does something that's obvious to everyone, that they should move on and find another job to do. The police department fires them, and because of rules in those contracts, those cops, even though it was obvious to everyone in that one specific instance that was a troubled cop, that they get rehired as a result of that. How much of the police and the whole police endorsement thing plays a role in that, in the rehiring of troubled police officers?
I mean, I think, this is a difficult conversation to have, because even with police officers, everybody has the same constitutional protection and innocent until proven guilty. So I think sometimes we even rush to judgment with police officers as well. And that's what the union's there to do. The union's there to protect that individual officer, to make sure all their rights are given to them. And I don't think we should expect less. That is the principle of what this country is built on. But I think when you systematically have somebody that, like we saw with this officer, with Mr. Floyd, I mean, he had a history. At that point, I think Metro, regardless of what anybody's saying, a police department has to take action, because it's all about notice, right? If they knew that this individual police officer had these kind of problems, they are putting the community in danger. And so they've got to figure it out, whether they put that police officer at a desk job and take him off the streets. A lot of times that's what it's going to come down to, as to the accountability of the police department. Obviously, again, in many civil cases, Metro's originally named, but the reality is Metro doesn't stay, and I'm talking about in Las Vegas, the police department doesn't stay in the civil lawsuit, because in a civil rights litigation, you have to draw a direct connection to the police department. So a lot of times police departments are getting kicked out. However, if you've got a situation where they're on notice, well, that changes the dynamic, and now they're legitimately in a lawsuit because they knew and should have done something.
Now, how far can you really go with a suit against a police department? Because at the end of the day, they're funded by the taxpayers and everything. I mean, so any fines that they pay inevitably come out of our pocket, correct?
You're 100% right, Tyler. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, it's the same with attorney fees. In civil rights litigation, if you are the prevailing party, you are entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. And you're absolutely right. The Clark County Commission, anytime Metro has a settlement, they have to get approval from the Clark County Commission to do it. And you're right, as citizens, absolutely, we're looking at, we're paying that. We're paying all those, we're paying the fees, we're paying for anything that a jury, a verdict that the jury provides. And sometimes you got to wonder too, I understand that there are going to be certain cases that a police department really has to dig their feet into because they don't feel like they've done anything wrong. But when it is obvious that something has been done, do we not try to settle that immediately? Take some accountability and figure out how we resolve it instead of dragging it, because these cases take years and years and years. A lot of times what happens is if at a summary judgment stage where the police department's trying to kick out the case early on, so there's no trial, if they lose that, they will always go up to the circuit court, which now we're up there for another year or 2 years. So this ends up being years and years and years. It is not very common that these kinds of cases get resolved early on. And some of them should, and maybe some of them shouldn't, but none of them do.
In the last couple of days, in the protests on the Strip and in downtown, we've heard of officers taking a knee, saying, out of respect, we understand why you're here. Mr. Floyd was killed. We understand why you're here. We understand why you're protesting and negotiating with protesters. There was a case where the protesters were walking down the Strip and stopping for the light to let traffic go through. I mean, you would never see that, and you never would have seen Metro in the old days negotiating directly with protesters and saying, we understand why you're here. Let's try and keep it together, and let's remember why we're here and not try to turn this into who can break the most windows.
And that goes back to being a community partner. They are members of the community. And so I think the more they show that by taking a knee and just engaging and really understanding, having empathy for why people are upset and recognizing that, you know what, I would have never done that, but this officer with Mr. Floyd, that was wrong. I mean, I think that goes so far. It's just very simple human nature characteristics, but it goes so much further, and it really just shows, okay, we're here to protect and serve. That serve element is them being in the community and being a part of the community and doing what's best for the community.
As a result of exactly what you're saying, being a community partner, what happens is the police come together. Now, these aren't real well organized protests. These are things that happen because people feel this pain and they take to the streets. But cops talking directly to protesters saying, we know that you're here to protest, and you need to know that in a couple of hours, the people that are going to be surging into your crowds are bad people who have come here specifically to do bad things. And as a result, they're getting cooperation from the just regular protesters, not people who are rioting and should be locked up in the first couple of minutes if possible. And so they are getting feedback. They are getting help. They are seeing some support from the other side. That never would have happened under the old Metro, right?
I think again, we're learning, right? We're evolving as a community, and those are the things that are, and just think of how simple that is, just to listen, right? Just for an officer to show that they care. It shows the community, okay, they get it. They're not supporting this. We've heard for so many years all over the country that part of the problem is when a cop does something bad, none of their fellow brethren will stand up and say, that's wrong. And so that's where I think the distrust, unfortunately, goes from just the individual officer that's done wrong to everybody. So I think when police officers start to recognize and aren't ashamed or are willing to say, yes, that was bad. We recognize that was not right. That earns a lot of respect from other people, because then people think, okay, our police department understands, our police department recognizes that this isn't how people should be treated.
So conversely, in these riots that are going on now, I know there's been a lot of bad protesters and bad rioters who've been throwing, frozen water bottles and all kinds of objects at the cops. Uh, For a lot of the protesters out there that think they're sort of immune to any kind of contact from the police officers when they're protesting, what sort of draws the line, and to what extent are the police officers able to advance on the protesters? So basically, at what point does it pretty much seem okay for the officer to just defend himself and, maybe put a protester to the floor?
I think when there's a threat, I mean, it's always going to come down to would a reasonable officer believe there's a threat? Just standing, speaking, we all have a First Amendment right to assemble and speak, right? And so nobody should question whether people should be able to protest. I mean, everybody should be able to protest. It's just in the manner that they do it. So at the point that they start to destruct property, or that they're threatening to harm other protesters or hurting officers, I mean, then you're going to expect that our police department has to react to that. That's fair. But they also, I think, because tensions are so high, you also don't want police officers to assume that every protester is somebody that's throwing frozen bottles at them or trying to harm them. And I think that becomes difficult. That line gets very blurred very easily when tensions are high on both sides. So I think the media, when they've shown images of Metro officers taking a knee or protesters shaking hands, I think those are the images we need to see, because that's the positive interaction and the mutual respect that's going on from both sides.
I'll tell you what you don't see, and I have seen some of these videos. What you don't see, the media is always drawn to, the police shooting and the rest of it, but you see police officers, this is not as part of the protest, but fighting on the street, fighting for their lives because they've pulled the wrong person over. The person is unarmed, but the cop's got a gun, and this person is intent on taking that gun away. And you see these cops rolling on the street, fighting until they're gassed. They know there's a possibility their gun can be taken, and they could be shot with their own pistol. And the cop just hangs on and hangs on because they're so disciplined. And there's never a day that you say, hooray for the police, he didn't shoot the guy. If I was near death, of course, I'd have to put the guy out. But you see that discipline, and it doesn't become news. But that's what good police officers do, and they put their lives at risk when they do that. I want to ask you, there's a big move, particularly given the kinds of cases that you handle. There is a big move from the federal government to use surplus weapons of war to hand them over to city police departments. How do you feel about that?
I mean, it's a question of whether you really want to raise the level up that high. Again, then you put everybody's backs up. The minute you make this announcement that this is how you're going to handle this, I think people they're already upset, and you're elevating them being upset. And I think that almost goes against the idea of this de-escalation. Are there other ways that we can have this conversation and get on the same page, and everybody recognizes us as police officers have a job to protect the streets, the protesters have a right to voice their First Amendment concerns? I don't know, Mark, that I feel that there may be certain situations that would be appropriate, but to take a blanket across the board, this is how we're going to handle every city, every incident, I think is not in the light of a world of de-escalation and understanding and empathy. I'm not sure that would make things better.
All of us have our opinions on the case of George Floyd. If you caught this case, how would you handle it? Where do you start?
I mean, it's so egregious. It's painful to watch. There's just so many things wrong with this case. Even Metro, speaking from Metro's own policy, one of the things is there are certain parts of your body that really, unless you're in a deadly force situation, officers should try to avoid. I don't think Minneapolis had that in their policy. We do, where Metro is supposed to avoid head, groin, neck, because they recognize those are very sensitive areas that could cause a lot of pain. And if you don't have to go there, you shouldn't be. I mean, the case it's just so egregious. There's no reason, especially when you have an unarmed person, to even there's just no reason for it. I don't know. I'm kind of lost of words, frankly. I mean, it just was completely unnecessary.
One of the
There's
officers. Go ahead. Go ahead, Tyler.
No, I was saying, as bad as the situation is, just on the charges, I know there's a lot of protesters that think, this isn't justice done unless he gets first degree murder. Can you elaborate on how difficult that is in this situation and the complexity of what requires the premeditation and what you think that kind of stands on this file, on this instance?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, premeditation, that's really the key with first degree murder, right? Was it premeditated? I mean, you would hear a prosecutor argue that premeditation can be done in a matter of seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That's not probably how the average person think about it. We think about premeditation as some long, drawn out thought process, but prosecutors will argue all day long that premeditation can be formed in a matter of seconds. So if that's the case, under that theory, what was he holding him down for? 8 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
Certainly in that amount of time. But dangerous conduct, does that rise to a level of first degree premeditation? I don't know. You also want to make sure that you can be credible in front of a jury and what they can get to convict him. And so I think their system Minneapolis is a little bit different than ours. I don't know in our situation if it would be more of a second degree murder, somewhere between a first degree and a second degree murder in Nevada. But I think going back to what I said originally is, if that had been me or you, do you think that we would get the same charging? Would that have been our original charge? I'm not so sure.
No. And what do you think's taking them so long, as they say that they're building up their case on the other officers to arrest the other officers?
That's a harder one, right? It's always easier when you've got the direct person that's causing the exact violation. The other officers allowed it to happen. I think there are probably a lot of dynamics to it. Morally, is it right? No. But the bystanders, a lot of them didn't get involved either. I mean, I think it's a rapid situation. People aren't necessarily always thinking. How many times have we all stepped back and said, oh my gosh, you know what? I probably should have stopped for that accident, or I should have done this. Or, I think people second guess themselves afterwards. The cop that did it was a veteran cop. It takes a lot of guts to stand up to a veteran cop. Again, morally, is it right or wrong? That's not for me to decide, but I think you've got to talk as far as what's legally correct. And so, although maybe morally corrupt to not step in, they've got to figure out, again, if a prosecutor is going to bring charges, they want to make sure they're going to stick. They want to make sure they can get a conviction. So, I know people want to rush to judgment and charges, but why not give them a little bit of time to figure out what those charges are and make a solid case instead of making a flimsy case that could get dismissed out?
Yeah, I think the general public thinks that building a case is much quicker than the reality of it.
And depending on the situation, I'm not so sure that's right.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned, that the officer involved in the actual homicide was a veteran cop. And the thing is that it should have been clear to any veteran investigator in any way, shape, or form. Mr. Floyd is basically being arrested for passing a $20 bill. If he was a counterfeiter, if he's the counterfeiter, he's got $10,000 or $20,000 in his trunk. He stuck around. There's no way in the world this guy got passed a $20 bill and he passed it on. If he was a real counterfeiter, he would have been out of there in a New York second. Certain things make themselves just obvious, and I just do not understand how this could have escalated to the rate that it did.
I had another question. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but when these police officers are assigned to areas, do they tend to assign officers to the areas that they better know, that their own areas where maybe they live and they have families, or do they separate them? Is there any sort of standard operation for that?
I don't know the answer to that. If I would guess, I would say no, that it's more random. I don't think that there's a specific connection. I think they're just put in whatever. Obviously with patrol, I think they're just randomly assigned when they start to get some of the specialized units, and they really don't have a neighborhood anymore.
Yeah, I was just wondering if having police officers assigned to the neighborhoods that they more interact with, that they understand, if that would ease some of these problems from happening.
Well, and I think that's something that we've seen across the nation with some of the successful police departments, is bringing police officers back into the community, having them there, having people see them. So when kids grow up, they're not scared of them. It's somebody they've interacted with. There's been positive interaction. And I think that has been what we've seen across the country, is the police departments that have done that and kind of infiltrated themselves into the community in a positive way has had a lot of benefit.
That's the backbone of community policing. You see police officers playing basketball in the middle of a shift with some kids on the street for 5 minutes, and I'm not the boogeyman, and I'm not here to hurt you. And I get the feeling that Metro is headed in the right direction, and I hope that all of this doesn't change all of that. Thank you for joining us today. I really do appreciate it, Paola. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
With that, we call it a day, the Vegas Legal Magazine podcast. Sincerely thanks to Paola Armeni of Clark Hill, Tyler Morgan, publisher of Vegas Legal Magazine. And if you have room in your heart, a couple of minutes, remember the daughter of George Floyd, 6-year-old Gianna, and the loss she and her family are suffering. And as of Wednesday, June 3rd, please don't forget 29-year-old Metro officer Shea Michelonis is fighting for his life at the University Medical Center. Our thoughts and prayers go out to both families.